Where's Shoma when we need her? Oh, good.
Okay.
All right, great.
That's on.
Great. So what I would like to do is to start with I have lots of slides, but what I'm going to do is run really quickly through them so that we have enough time for Q&A. And I try to cover all bases, as you say in America. This year started with a big promise for us because Israel seemed to be spiraling down through this almost 3 years of chronic political instability. And the beginning of this year started with a big promise because the new year also produced finally a political decision. 3.5 years of indecision ended with Israel's 36th coalition government. We'll talk about the structure of this government, but one of the questions that we asked ourselves is what are the origins of this seemingly improbable Israeli, survivability of Israel's democracy? Because where is it coming from? How come Israeli democracy is so resilient, vibrant, and robust? And mind you, Israeli democracy just survived perhaps the most sophisticated, the most decisive onslaught on most of its institutions. And that onslaught came from none other than the prime minister himself. And so this is a big question that we're asking ourselves. What are the origins of this resilience? And there are several answers to that question. One answer says, that the origin really is the democratic tradition of the countries of origin of the pioneers. And those people say, look, after World War II, many countries were created, new countries, new national identities. Most of them were established, including the United Nations, with a more or less optimistic worldview, inclusive. You remember the UN Charter, 1945, when the United Nations was established in San Francisco. Very, very positive and optimistic outlook. But most of them also disintegrated into either authoritarianism or one-party regime or one-party system. And so one answer is that Israel's democracy is a unique phenomenon because of the countries of origin, but that's not the case. When you look at the pioneers, the newcomers that came to this place 10 minutes from here, my family came in 1874 from a place called Bukhara, certainly not a democracy. My other side of the family, they came in 1912 from a place called Yemen, certainly not a democracy. But even those who came from Europe, right? Ili Gorlitsky was from Romania, right? Alexander, where your family's from Romania?
His parents were Polish.
Okay,
Ukraine.
Poland was definitely authoritarian. Most of the newcomers came from other authoritarian Poland, Tsarist Russia, or if you were lucky to escape Germany before 1933 or 1939, you came from Nazi Germany. So this argument that Israel is a democracy because of the countries of origin doesn't really fly. The second argument that people make is that Israel's democracy comes from the biblical roots, right? But that's, again, very difficult to find any evidence for democracy or elective representation in the Bible. Israeli political theorist, Professor Avineri, Shlomo Avineri, who was also the Director General of our Ministry of Foreign Affairs at one time, a person who I greatly admire, claims that the real answer, the real origin, is actually in Jewish communal life in the diaspora. The Jews that lived in the diaspora needed to run their own organizations, whether for education or welfare, and they had to create a tradition of representation. And people were elected, just like you elect in the synagogue, or you elect in the federation, or you elect, to various Jewish organizations in the community. It's been going on for hundreds of years. dating back to the early days of Jewish civilization. And Jewish communal life is the most valid explanation as to the robust nature of Israeli democracy. Now, when you look at the overall structure of Israeli democracy, you can make the mistake and say, well, it looks a lot like the American system. You have the three branches. But the truth is that Israeli democracy is fundamentally different than American democracy. First of all, we don't have a constitution. Instead, we have a set of basic laws. There was a decision made by the first Knesset in 1949. In Israel, famously, there is no separation between religion and state, which creates a whole set of problems. One of the questions that I received for today was about the relationship between American Jewry and the Israeli government. This, of course, this fact has tremendous impact on this. In Israel, the prime minister does not have any presidential powers. The prime minister is not the commander-in-chief. The prime minister is not the diplomat-in-chief. In Israel, the ruler is the government, the cabinet. The sovereign is the Knesset. The sovereign is the Knesset, not the government. And there's a very, very heavily regulated system, again, that controls the ties between government and business. We had a very long string of Israeli officials in prison because of violations. By the way, things that are completely legal in the United States, in the relationship between elected officials and business, are 100% illegal in Israel. Most of your elected officials, when it comes to campaign funding, if they had done in Israel what they're allowed to do in the States, probably would have ended up in jail. So the Israeli system is dramatically different than the American system. Israel, on a scale of religiosity, despite of what people may think, on a scale of religiosity is far more secular than the United States from a cultural point of view. And of course, the biggest difference between the two systems that while in the United States, the gravitation is towards the extremes, in Israel, the gravitation is towards the center. That's where you want to be. If you want to have a political future in Israel, you have to be a centrist. In the United States, we're seeing exactly the opposite. It's been going on for a long time now, since the famous deadlock, political deadlock, even during the first Obama administration. Now, a lot of people are surprised that this government is able to survive. People are very concerned about the survivability of this government because of the fragile or the seemingly fragile coalition. They say, well, it's only 60 versus 59. How can this coalition survive? But the truth is that it's more than 60. The truth is that the Arabs that have altogether 11 seats in this government, in this Knesset, the Arabs have no other choice but to support this coalition from the outside. The Israeli left wing, which is not big, the anti-Netanyahu bloc is more than 60 because of the support of the Arabs and because of the support of two right-wing parties or 2.5 right-wing parties. But the left has no other option. So this is the only coalition that the left wing in Israel can have, and more importantly, that the Arabs can have. Now, one of the Arab parties, interestingly enough, the more radical of the two from an ideological point of view, joined the coalition, which means that this party will now have access to budgets. First time in Israel's history. Maybe that is the true legacy left by Benjamin Netanyahu. When I speak about Netanyahu, it's important to understand the main reason why Netanyahu is no longer the prime minister is because of the war that he waged against Israeli constitutionalism. He basically attacked the most sacred institutions in Israel's system, from the office of the president through the Knesset, the attorney general, whom he personally appointed, and of course, most famously, his attacks against the police, law enforcement, and against the court system. These are things that really bothered Israeli. What is Israeli constitutionalism? Constitutionalism in Hebrew, mamlachtiyut, was a concept conceived mostly by Ben Gurion and his loyalists that basically would it was a solution to the problem of how do we create a common ground? How do we create the glue that will keep together the Jews that came from Yemen, from Poland, and from Bukhara? What do they have in common other than the fact that they're Jews? They don't even daven the same way, right? Their prayers are different. The service is different. Everything about them is different. The culture is different. The language is different. How do we connect them? And Ben Gurion brilliantly, because of the external threat that Israel faced, not only since 1948, but since 1860, since the first neighborhood was created outside of the old city in Jerusalem by Sir Moses Montefiore, 1860. That was the beginning of the friction, the physical friction between the Arabs and the Jews in the land of Israel. So Ben Gurion decided that creating one central military entity, in this case, the IDF, which was also his first decision as a prime minister, when the government was founded, was formed, the first decision Ben Gurion brought to the first government of the state of Israel was the creation of the military, meaning merging all four different paramilitary groups. Of course, the largest of them was the Haganah with 55,000 people. Then Palmach was the second largest with 6,000 people. Number three was Menachem Begin's Irgun with about 2,500 people. And then the Stern Gang, maybe with 1,100, 1,200 people. That's it. That was the size of Israel's military. Altogether, maybe 65,000 people. About 6,000 people died in the War of Independence, which is 10% almost of the total number of soldiers, and about 1% of the total population in 1948. Imagine the United States going to war now, losing 3.3 million people in one war. That's more or less what Israel lost in 1948, proportionately. So Israeli constitutionalism put the IDF at the center, and it was about the creation of the new Jew. That required, first of all, the negation of the diaspora, which was not an easy thing because most Jews, I don't have to tell you, chose the diaspora. When they were given a chance, they did not come to Palestine. They went to other places, right? Between 1850 and 1924, until the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, about 2.3 million Jews left Eastern Europe. The vast majority of them came to North America, US and Canada. Only a handful of Jews came to Palestine. That's the truth. It's not that because they were anti-Zionists. It's because this place, this piece of land where I'm right now, had nothing to offer them. They were looking for a better future, better life, and this was not the place. Here, what you had was malaria and dysentery and horrible weather and no food and extreme poverty. You know, my mother's family came from Yemen in 1912, but then they went back to Egypt because there was no food here. So my grandmother actually, as a baby, spent her formative years in Egypt. That's why she spoke Egyptian Arabic, although she was Yemenite, my grandmother, my late grandmother. And so the new ethos was based on two pillars. One was defense, and the other was agriculture. If you may, the sword and the sickle. The combination of the sword and the sickle was really the new ethos that Ben Gurion was presenting through his idea of constitutionalism. And of course, the institutions of the state were at the heart of this approach. They were a source of pride. That's why they decided to create the function of the president, which is largely symbolic, largely ceremonial, in order to, and the first president, of course, was Chaim Weizmann. This is also why Israeli society is so militaristic. I was asked about that. What are the origins of Israeli civic militarism? First of all, the fact that Israel had to face unprecedented security and military challenges like no other country in the 20th century. Just look at the number of times Israel had to defend itself. The second thing is, again, IDF is not only a security organization, it also functions as a social organization in Israel. IDF is greatly influential in the field of education, in the field of inclusion, diversity, integration of the various groups. One of the biggest debates that we have in Israel is about whether the Haredi kids and the Arab kids should serve in the army. And I have to tell you that both, at least on the Arab side, we know that the Arabs definitely would like to serve in the army. Many of them. It's the army that doesn't want them. We can talk about that later. And then, of course, a famous Israeli social psychologist, Daniel Bartal, coined the term the Masada complex. He even published a book about it. And that is the fact that Israel, in many ways is although we have access to the Mediterranean, in many ways we're landlocked, meaning it's impossible to get to Israel through ground transportation. The only way to get in is either to fly or to take a boat, because we are surrounded by countries that even when they have peace with us, they're not safe for Israelis, including Egypt and Jordan. I don't recommend for Israelis to travel there nowadays. So, envisioning or imagining that we are as a collective on top of Masada. This is the complex. If you may, Amos Oz used to say that our complex is that as Israelis, is that during the days we fight the Arabs, but during the nights we fight the Nazis.
Yeah.
And this is really the epitome of that complex that the Israelis live through day in and day out. And then, of course, there is a complete and total dominance of the Israeli security establishment. I don't have to say to you, those of you who know Israel, know that Israel never really and truly exercised diplomacy. Israel's understanding of diplomacy is that diplomacy is the continuation of war with other means. The purpose of diplomacy is to help the military achieve a decisive victory. This has been the approach since day one. Hasn't really changed. And when certain people in our Zionist history engaged in diplomacy, like Theodor Herzl, Chaim Weizmann, and so on, the kind of diplomacy that they engaged in was based on advocacy, based on the perception or the view that the diplomat's role is to litigate on behalf of her country or his country. And I say her because Golda Meir was one of the more, she was a superb diplomat. There's no question about it. She was a superb public speaker. She was a superb fundraiser. And Barbara mentioned my late mother-in-law, Pearlie. She knew her very well. But true diplomacy, which is all about opportunities, which is all about, true diplomacy never really took place in the Israeli system since the early days of Zionism, and we can discuss that as well. The current government is a very unique government. It's an 8-party coalition, which means that the prime minister has to spend a great deal of time, perhaps the majority of his time, just maintaining the coalition. We have 9 females in the cabinet. We have the first LGBT head of party. We have the first Islamist party in Israel's history. These are all great things. What keeps them together? These are the 8 names of the leaders of the 8 parties, including 1 Arab. The one thing that keeps them together, because it's the most unlikely coalition, it's the most unlikely partnership. There's nothing that connects Avigdor Lieberman, who's a nationalist, with Mansour Abbas, who's an Islamist. The only thing that keeps them together is the animosity towards Netanyahu. So none of them wants to see Netanyahu coming back. And Netanyahu comeback is their worst nightmare. And they're willing to be very, very flexible in order to make sure that Netanyahu is not coming back. And Netanyahu, on his part, is doing everything within his power to solidify his leadership of Likud for years to come, which means, oddly enough and strangely enough, that Netanyahu is the main reason for this coalition. So it's true that he is no longer in government. He's now the head of the opposition, but he is still the most important person in Israeli political system because his very presence in Israel's political life is the insurance policy of this government. I know it's a very difficult thing to understand if you're not really, if you don't follow the insanity that is Israeli political life, then it's very difficult to understand that. But on the one hand, and I'm sure that he rationally understands that he's the only thing that keeps them intact. On the one hand, he rationally understands that, but then on the other hand, there's no power in the world that will push him to resign. And so that's how we ended up where we are in terms of the coalition. When you look at his last 12 years in power, obviously there are certain areas where you see great progress, like the economy, like the international standing of Israel, but also areas of concern where no progress was achieved. Iran's never been closer to a nuclear bomb. Hamas and Hezbollah never been stronger. And when you look at Israel's performance as opposed to its fellow members of the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, it's the elite club of global economies, then there's a great deal of concern about Israel's performance. The balance of good governance is the ability to create a healthy balance between risks and opportunities. If you're all about opportunities, then the risk is that you will run a reckless foreign policy. If you're all about risk, it means that you become risk averse, and that's a very easy recipe for paralysis and stagnation. And I think that that's what many people felt about Netanyahu. He was too risk averse. He was too concerned with risks, downplaying opportunities, including the Abraham Accord. A lot of people forgot that about 3 weeks before the Abraham Accords were announced, Netanyahu had different plans, entirely different plans. He wanted to annex parts of the Jordan Rift Valley. So many Israelis felt that this healthy balance was not maintained during his time. I was asked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's what we're seeing now is the result of some very deep social and political undercurrents that started since the early days of the Oslo Accords, the early 1990s, later on the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. But more importantly, 3 events contributed to the demise of the territorial compromise concept. At one time, the territorial compromise concept was the strongest political camp in Israel. And that idea was that if you give the Palestinians what they want, namely territory, what you will get in return is peace and security. Now, there were 3 historical incidents where the Palestinians were offered some form of territorial compromise. In all 3 of them, they rejected. The first was the rejection of the Bill Clinton plan in 2000. The second was the Palestinian reaction to the Gaza pullout, because if you think about the Gaza pullout from a territorial compromise point of view, it's the Palestinian wet dream. Ariel Sharon, of all people, went to the Palestinians and said, here, you get Gaza is all yours 100% until the last square inch, it's yours. And instead of turning it into the Singapore, the Middle East, what they did, they turned it into a launching pad of repeated attacks, 14,000 rockets since 2005. Imagine 14,000 rockets on Chicago or 14,000 rockets on Brooklyn. It's inconceivable. And then, of course, 2008, the Olmert plan, where Olmert is proposing 100%. The Palestinians don't even get back to him with an answer. So what's at the core? What characterized the last 12 years? These are the 2 narratives that the 2 sides were telling themselves about themselves, right? Netanyahu's narrative was, time is on my side. And Abbas's narrative was, including last week, all or nothing. The maximalist view, And this was really the reason for the lack of progress in the last 12 years under Netanyahu, because Mahmoud Abbas theoretically is a very convenient partner for Israel. He's the first Palestinian leader ever to commit to nonviolence. So you could say, supposedly, at least on its face, it's a wonderful thing. But when you look at his positions, very difficult to move forward, because he, unlike Arafat, who was interested in a Palestinian state minus, Abbas is unwilling to compromise, all or nothing. And usually when you're not pragmatic, you end up with nothing. Netanyahu, on the other hand, lost his sense of urgency. One of the reasons Yitzhak Rabin wanted to make peace with the Palestinians is because Yitzhak Rabin felt a sense of urgency. He was a pessimistic human being. He did not think that the Israeli army is good enough. I actually heard him say that myself. His desire to reach an agreement with the Palestinians came from a very pessimistic place about Israel's ability to defend itself. He was a military man. He was the commander of the IDF during the 6-Day War. He understood the army. He saw the difference between the army of the 1960s and the army of the 1990s, and he was very, very concerned. But Netanyahu doesn't seem to have that sense of urgency, or at least did not seem to have that sense of urgency. He was acting as if Israel has all the time in the world. And this is really the collision between the two. These are the two narratives. Now, Naftali Bennett, who replaced Netanyahu as the prime minister, at least for now, is behaving as if he too believes that time is on Israel's side. All right. And that's really is the debate. If you want to understand where people stand on the conflict, you have to ask them this question. Do you think that time is on Israel's side or not? If someone says to you, no, time is not on our side, every day that goes by, we are in a more difficult position, and we'll explain what it means, then you know that these people are interested in moving forward. But when someone says to you, I think that is the time is on Israel's side, that what they mean is that let's maintain the status quo. Now, I can tell you as someone who's teaching international relations at NYU, status quo is an invention of analysts and university professors. There is no such thing as status quo in real life. Status quo is a theoretical paradigm. There is no such thing as status quo. In real life, every day something happens. In real life, every day, there are occurrences that shape reality. Status quo is a theoretical paradigm. It doesn't really exist in real life. And so it's a very dangerous misperception to believe in status quo in international relations, right? No one saw the collapse of the Soviet Union. There were thousands of Sovietologists in the best universities in the world. None of them predicted, because they were all buying into this argument of the status quo between the two superpowers, right? I can give you many examples. But national ethos plays a very, very important role in understanding what's happening in the Middle East these days. Certainly in the case of Iran's nuclear aspirations, in the case of Iran, their national ethos plays a critical role. Iran wants to go back to the days of its glory, of the days of the Persian Empire. Netanyahu's policy, those of you who don't know, Iran has always been a big item on Israel's agenda vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis the European Union, vis-a-vis even China and India, vis-a-vis the United Nations, but always was very, very, the discussion was very discreet, very confidential, behind closed doors. Israeli leaders from Yitzhak Rabin all the way to Netanyahu did not look for big headlines. Netanyahu changed that. He decided, for whatever reason, to turn it into a public event, to turn it into a public affairs issue. If you may, style was overriding substance in his approach. And two things happened by way of unintended consequence. The first is that a misperception was created as if this is Israel's problem solely. And the world, especially European countries that dealt with Iran, saw this as a very easy way out. If Israel is complaining about Iran all the time, and if Israel is, carrying the banner of the anti-Iran approach, let Israel deal with this. That's the first misperception. The second misperception, that is perhaps even more dangerous, is the fact that under Netanyahu, Israel was perceived as a country that doesn't want to play with the rest of the team, meaning Israel voluntarily walked out of the negotiation rooms. Israel voluntarily gave up on the opportunity to influence the Iran deal from the inside. And that's a sign of a profound lack of confidence in diplomacy. And I can tell you again, in international relations is something that you don't do. When you're given an opportunity to influence, you never do that. You never walk out of the room and say, I'm not interested. This is a big mistake because today we're facing the grave ramifications of this policy. Iran has never been closer to a nuclear military capability. If in 2009, when Netanyahu resumed his premiership, Iran had 35 kilos of enriched uranium, then today they have tons of enriched uranium. And the only thing that stands between them and the bomb is a decision. They are quickly approaching the status of a breakthrough capability. And once that happens, we're going to enter a new phase in international relations, not only in Israel's ties with Iran. Iran is looking, first of all, in the Islamic world. They see themselves as a small, fragile minority country within the Islamic world, right? 75% of the Muslims are Sunnis. 85%, only 15 are Shiites. And the vast majority of those Shiites live in Iran. So Iran is the largest Shiite country in the world. It's a big island of Shiites in a sea, in an ocean of Sunnis. So that's their prime target. Then after that is regional hegemony. And maybe after that is their issue with the Western world, with American culture. And within that, they have an issue with Israel. But Israel is not their prime target. And it's very, very important to understand that. Same thing has happened in Afghanistan, the national ethos in Afghanistan. We talk about nations and we forget the Sykes-Picot Agreement, 1916, or the agreements that in the mid-19th century that created most of the countries in Africa. Nation state as a concept was imposed on most countries in our region. Iraq is not an organic country. And Afghanistan was never an organic country. We're talking about tens of ethnic groups, talking about tens of different religious groups, tens of hundreds of clans, if not thousands of clans. And when we accuse the Afghanis that we came in the name of American exceptionalism to build your nation, I just read a wonderful story in the New York Times today about whether it was really about nation building or not. It was a review of a book written by a Washington Post reporter about what happened in Afghanistan. And it's a big question. What was the purpose of American presence in Afghanistan? So at first they said, okay, it was about the elimination of Al-Qaeda. But then it became about nation building in the name of American exceptionalism, right? American exceptionalism is almost the duty that America has to export its ideas and values to the world. Freedom and and democracy and so on. But in order for that to happen, in order for that to succeed, the other side, the recipient, has to believe in the same ideas. Otherwise, it's very difficult for it to happen. So rather than sending international relations experts and military experts, maybe what they should have done is work more with social anthropologists that would have told them that there is no such thing as an Afghani nation, that Afghanistan is an artificial creation. And that's why when we expected the Afghani fighters to fight, they did not fight. We got upset. They said, you were shamefully defeated by Taliban after 20 years that we armed you and we trained you and we gave you the best equipment in the world. But the truth is, and we accuse them that they don't know how to fight, but the truth is that if there's one thing the Afghanis know how to do is to fight. It's just that they had no reason to fight because they don't believe in the nation state the way we do. Their loyalty is given to a different entity. And in their case, it's their tribe, it's their faith, it's their family, it's their clan. And you see this time and again. You see this today in Africa. You see this even here in Israel. You see it among Jews, among non-Jews, especially when you're looking, when you're considering the impact of social media. U.S.-Israel special relationship always stood on several legs. Here I painted in red the areas of that I think are at risk. The number one pillar of the relationship was always the Protestant spirit of the United States. The United States was established by Protestants who fled Europe because of the Catholics. And those Protestants, their predisposition when it came to Jewish life and Jewish revival in the Holy Land was extremely positive. A lot of people talk about who was the first president to really act on behalf of the Jewish people or the plight of the Jews. This is way before the first Zionist Congress. You won't believe this. It happened in 1840. The first American president to intervene on behalf of the Jews in the Middle East was Martin Van Buren. The year was 1840, and the event was the Damascus blood libel. And at the urging of several rabbis, most notably Rabbi Isaac Leeser of Philadelphia. And remember, 1840, this is when Alexis de Tocqueville is traveling the United States, writing his book about the American democracy. America was not a superpower, was far from being a superpower. This is 25 years before the Civil War. Martin Van Buren is putting pressure on the Turkish Empire to release the 13 Jewish families that were captured as a result of a false blood libel in Damascus. Several of them died. For them, it was too late. But the Turks complied with Van Buren. Van Buren was motivated by religious feelings and religious virtues. The second pillar of that relationship was the fact that both economies and both societies are based on knowledge. The source of Israeli economic resilience is the fact that Israeli economy is based on concepts, on ideas, on knowledge. Israeli universities are very strong. Same thing in the United States. When you look at the leading producer of conceptual products in the world is the United States. The United States is the number one producer of knowledge in the world. No other countries even close to coming to be number two. When you look at the list of the top 100 brand names in the world, about 80% of them are American brands. There's not even one Russian brand in the list of the top 100 strongest brand names in the world. I think that says something about the strength of the United States. And interestingly, many Americans don't see that. Many Americans are 100% confident that America is declining and it's the end. I can tell you, as an outsider who's been studying the United States for decades, America is in a very good position, despite of everything that is happening happening all over the world. The other three legs were, of course, America's interest in oil, which was translated to America's interest in the Middle East. That's going to change. It's going to change because of the fact that climate change is going to introduce renewable energy. Oil will become less and less important, also because oil reserves are depleting in the Middle East. And thanks to technology, oil reserves can be found elsewhere, whether it's in the Pacific Ocean or even in Antarctica or in Canada or in Wisconsin, where have you. A fourth pillar was always security. Again, that's changing too, because of the fact that Israel may not play such an important role in the future for the interest of the United States. What will Israel do if the United States will disengage militarily from this region? Again, America will not have the economic interest. What will Israel do? And lastly, the question of values. And again, democracy is a very important virtue, but there's a new coalition in the United States. Some people call it the coalition of minorities. It's becoming increasingly more and more powerful politically. And that coalition, and I set aside their agenda specifically vis-a-vis Israel, but generally speaking, the new American voter, who is a product of this new participatory culture, doesn't see favorably any usage of power, any deployment of force, whether military force or police force, is being viewed unfavorably. That's a very, very important factor. Now, Israel is behaving as if it's completely unaware of this. And again, I was involved in some groundbreaking research about Israel's image in the United States, about how Americans feel toward Israel 20 years ago after 9/11. And we already then identified this. People think today, especially the young, you go to college campuses, that using force is illegitimate. Now, you can agree with it, you can disagree with it. That's a fact. And now you need to learn how to live with it. What do you do when, I don't know if you had a chance to see the late night talk show hosts during the last Gaza confrontation, especially John Oliver and Trevor Noah. Both of them accused Israel of war crimes. They didn't think that Hamas did anything wrong. Bombing for years, civilians, that's okay. But when a country is using military force against civilians, no, that's not okay. Again, I'm not justifying it. I'm just telling you that's what we have to deal with now. And again, I don't think Israel is prepared to understand the deep implications of this. As I mentioned before, Bennett, I call him the accidental prime minister, is very, very courageous. He's doing something that I don't think was done by any leader. Maybe recently, I just heard in the United States, people using the same language, but he did it right at the outset. When he became the prime minister, he said, we have to live with this virus. Let's find ways to do it. Because of the dramatic differences, ideological differences, his coalition is going to focus on domestic issues, most notably the budget, the healthcare system, the legal system, of course, improving governance and improving the civil service. When it comes to the regional picture, I don't expect this coalition to produce any breakthrough with the Palestinians. Probably with the support of the Biden administration, they can achieve some progress with Saudi Arabia. Things with Turkey are getting better. And of course, on the Iran issue, Israel will do whatever the Americans will do. But one thing we have to remember has nothing to do with Israel, has nothing to do with the United States, has everything to do with internal processes that happened throughout the Arab world since the so-called Arab Spring that broke out some 10 years ago. There is a significant and sharp decline in the conventional military capabilities of Israel's traditional enemies. In the first place, Syria. Right? Syria was a big concern militarily for Israel, but Syria has disintegrated and now is facing a major internal chaos. And that should impact, again, Israel's strategic outlook. In terms of Israel's international standing, and here Netanyahu certainly deserves credit, Israel is experiencing an unprecedented period of intimacy with China, with India, with the United States, with Brazil, with the world's greatest powers. When it comes to the future, and I'm about to finish my presentation, bear this in mind. When I was born, 1962, there were maybe 2.3 million Israelis. When I was 11 years old, the Yom Kippur War broke out. There were 3.4 million Israelis. I think, Barbara, you were in Israel then. And today we're 9.4 million Israelis, and I'm being told that by 2048, when Israel will celebrate 100 years, we're going to be 17 million people. Now, there's no other country in the Western world that can show such trajectory, unprecedented. So that projected massive population growth is going to turn Israel into what I call a country on steroids, what we say triple espresso. You will see, and you're already beginning to see this in science, in arts, and culture. Look at what Israel is doing in Hollywood these days. It's only the beginning. It's only the beginning of this tremendous takeoff. Take the issue of water. When Israel was established, the number one existential threat was lack of water. It was not the Arabs. Today, Israel reached the level of 100% independence. We produce all the water that we need. We're on the verge of becoming independent when it comes to energy production because of natural gas and oil discovered in the Mediterranean. And of course, as I mentioned before, the fact that Israel is the number one producer of conceptual products per capita in the world is unbelievable. Israel sent the third largest contingent to NASDAQ. We have more patents registered per capita than any other country in the world. We have more scientific papers published per capita than any other country in the world. Collectively, Israeli universities, we have only 10 research universities in our small country. They're ranked top in the world. We have consistently 2 Israeli universities that are ranked in the top 50 universities in the world. And so all those things turn Israel into a major hub of creativity in all walks of life. There's a big misperception that Israel is a hub of creativity only in high tech. It's not true. High tech is a very small sector. Israel is a hub of creativity in lifestyle and leisure, in environmental solutions. When you look at the diversity and inclusion, there's so many ethnic groups, so many languages, so many colors, so many scents in Israel. And of course, science and technology, arts and culture, and healthcare, not to mention international aid programs. So these are all things that are happening in Israel. I'll be more than happy to, this is then my last slide here. I really believe that Israel is on the verge of historical breakthrough in all those areas. And with your permission, I'd like to end the slideshow and open the discussion for your questions, please.
Bravo.
And if you can just say your name and where you're based, I'll be very happy to answer your questions.
Alexander?
Ido, thank you. That was fascinating. I have lots of questions, so I'll try and keep it limited. But one of the things you were talking about during the Netanyahu period and what you called the strengths of his governance was one to do with the international standing. And I think that's quite curious in a way because, you know, he obviously created relationships with various Arab states such as Bahrain and the UAE. And in many ways, he kind of consolidated Israeli the Israeli position. But on the other hand, in terms of international standing, I think the international perception of Israel on many levels has never really been lower, as evidenced really by the way kind of young people in universities and the BDS movement, and to do with, and even the UN has taken up kind of positions towards Israel that are much more kind of challenging than they've been in the past. So I was just kind of wondering whether there's a kind of disparity between branding on an international scale, and I think the branding issue is kind of interesting in terms of your involvement and your interest.
So it's a very good question. Look, the anti-Israel sentiment certainly did not start with Netanyahu. You know, this whole BDS thing started back in the 1940s. 1945, in fact, was the year when the Arab economic boycott was enacted by the Arab League. So the idea of boycott is not new. I would say, on the contrary, whereas the Arab economic boycott has been very successful, isolating Israel from the 1940s until the late 1970s, only in the early 1980s, the boycott de facto was removed, as opposed to the BDS, which is largely an online-based agitation with no real results. Israel is not being boycotted today, certainly not in America. The only place where Israel is being boycotted is in the Arab world. Now, having said that, Netanyahu gets a lot of blame. Why? Because of what I showed you before. When you declare, time is on my side, you're inviting criticism. And that's what happened. Luckily and sadly for all of us, luckily for Netanyahu and sadly for all of us, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, is sharing the blame with him because of his narrative. But both of their narratives, which collided in the last 12 years, were inconducive to any progress. And that's really the problem. So Israel became, in a world of BLM, in a world of, where people want to be on the progressive side, Israel became, Israel basically positioned itself on the wrong side of every issue. Let me give an example. Climate change. Climate change, it's one of the positive changes that Bennett introduced. He went to the United Nations, before that he went to Biden, with agenda on climate, first time in 12 years. During the Netanyahu era, climate change was not on the agenda whatsoever. Now it's the most important issue in the world, not for Israel. So all the things that your question is very important. All those things existed before. Israel was never popular. People talk to me about campuses. And let me tell you, I was a student at Emerson College during the first Intifada. What's happening today is a piece of cake. It's a walk in the park next to what I had to go through as a student in the late 1980s. And people tell me that even before there was a state of Israel, Zionism was never accepted in the academic intellectual circles. Do I have to remind you? All the great Jewish intellectuals in the United States that were critical of Zionism. Zionism was never popular. In fact, I would argue that it is popular today in the United States more than ever before. Never been so popular as today. It's not popular in absolute numbers, but you never had more American Jews identifying with the goals of the Zionist movement like you have today, statistically. And so in 1948, only 17%, 17 of American Jews identified as Zionists. A fact. Today, way more than 17%. Not 70%, but way more than 17.
I remember my parents saying Israel needed to get smart and its diplomats needed to quit saying to parents, send us your children, because as Americans, we were American Jews. We didn't want to go to Israel, and it was a bad approach.
Right, but it was necessary for Ben Gurion to create constitutionalism. He wanted to create the new Jew, and the new Jew had to be a fighter and had to be a farmer. And there's a wonderful documentary called Children of the Sun, which is based on footage of children in the kibbutzim in the 1940s, 1950s, and the work of Bruno Bettelheim. I don't know if you guys remember him, but the Children of the Sun, again, was the ethos of we're going to create a different kind of Jew. And that's why my name, you see here, it says Ido Ahroni Aronoff. Where does the Ahroni come from? Aronoff is my original name, but Aronoff was diaspora, was a Russian. The Russian name, it means the son of Aaron. And Ben Gurion said, you can't have a name that sounded from the diaspora. You have to change it to a Hebrew name. So my father changed it to Ahroni. But he never liked it. So after my father died 4 years ago, I went back to Aronoff.
When my daughter Tali was still in utero, I was trying to come up with names to refer to the future person and was laughing so hard about making names Hebrew that I came up with Chief of Staff Flipper Ben Kipper. And
I like that.
Yeah. And some of those names were just sounded Hebrew, but had no meaning. Or if they had a meaning, it was a ridiculous meaning. So I remember when I joined the Foreign Service, the first day I was in the Foreign Service, I was introduced to an ambassador whose last name was Paltzu, Mordechai Paltzu. What is Paltzu in Hebrew? It's lasso. You know the show Ted Lasso? So this was Motke Lasso. And I was laughing because it didn't make any sense. Paltzu in Hebrew. Why would you name yourself Lasso? But that was the time. People changed their names, and they were happy to do it.
well, we laughed.
Can I
David
ask
and
about
I
the-
laughed a lot.
Could I also ask about you were talking earlier on about Israel basically being a secular nation, and yet obviously because of the proportional representation, it seems that the religious parties have had an incredible influence on kind of electing the that basically being the power brokers. So being in Israel, I mean, obviously depends where you are. It doesn't always seem to be like a secular country, with buses stopping on Shabbat and so on.
So
And
when I was
that also seems to relate to the growth of the population, because obviously the Orthodox Jews are quite kind of comfortable with very, very large families. So I was just wondering how you feel that influences.
So how do you measure the level of religiosity? One simple way to do it is to measure rate of participation in religious ritual. Now, in that regard, America is way, way more religious than Israel. We live in Harlem. When I'm in New York, I live in Harlem. In Harlem, everywhere you throw a stone, you hit a church. Every 100 feet, there's a church. I've traveled America all over the place. Wherever you go, churches and churches and churches and churches and churches. When I was growing up in Israel, on the Sabbath, you couldn't go anywhere. Nothing was open. Nothing, zero. Today, The whole country is open on the Sabbath. Wherever you go, even in Jerusalem, you can go and see a movie on the Sabbath and find a restaurant. But Tel Aviv and the rest of the country. So it's true that more and more Israelis connect with Jewish tradition. For example, when you look at Israeli popular music today, it's largely Jewish soul music. Jewish soul music. But in terms of religious practice, most Israelis are like my father. My father described himself as a non-practicing Orthodox Jew. So the synagogue that he would never go to was an Orthodox synagogue. But he never went.
I remember coming out of Yom Kippur services, Kol Nidre, one night, and I'm suffused with the holiday. And I take a turn and I hear beep, beep, beep. And as I get onto the main road, there are hundreds of bicycles. It became known as the Day of the Bicycles.
Right. That still is, by the way, still is.
Is it, you know?
So Yom Kippur, for example, is, I'll give you another example. Okay, Ben Gurion took the holiday of Shavuot, which is the holiday of the giving of the Torah in the diaspora, and completely changed it into a celebration of the harvest. So when I was a kid, for me, Shavuos was a wonderful holiday. We would go to the kibbutzim and we'll eat dairy products and we'll celebrate and dance. And it was a very cheerful holiday and all that. And when I came to serve as a diplomat in North America in the 1990s, I realized that Shavuot in the diaspora has a completely different meaning. Take Hanukkah, celebration of the Maccabees. Who were the Maccabees? If the Maccabees live today, they will do a true crime series on them on Netflix. It was a bunch of hoodlums. They were criminals. Now they changed completely the narrative because they, again, remember, the goal was to create a new Jew. And so that's what they did. So to go back to Alexander's question, so it's not that Israel is a secular country in absolute terms. It's on a scale of religiosity, it's less religious than you would expect. Israel's image, when we conducted studies in the United States, the studies show that Israel was associated in people's minds with two things. First was conflict, meaning bloodshed, military, so on, conflict, tension. And the second was religiosity, orthodoxy. And the truth is, yes, there are many Orthodox people in Israel, but the society is by and large non-practicing, secular, and again, contrary to what most people think, is actually very inclusive.
Can you get a non-religious?
You know,
can you get a non-religious marriage? Oh,
Wait.
I'm sorry. Well, go ahead. I'll Alexander, go ahead. I mean, I was going to say a couple things. So they may not be going to shul, but a lot of those ideas are in the law. Example that Alexander was going to bring up, the divorce laws. There's no recognition of same-gender marriage as a real marriage. There's toleration of same-gender relationships.
Civil.
The fact is, there are still shutting down of municipal services. I have to say, I didn't spend Shabbat in any other city other than Jerusalem. Okay. Now, many of those people walking down the street, which had no traffic or public transportation, may not have been in shul, although they may have been earlier in the day and now no longer were. But the point is, and you have enormous carves out for religion, for Orthodox young men and women not going into doing military service, and on and on and on. So they may be religious. This is the religion permeating the society.
The Orthodox.
Right. Yeah. So what you're saying,
and
these
it's there.
these are all accurate depictions of reality in Israel,
And it's real.
but they're also manifestations of the political power of the religious parties. And so if they did not have that political clout, they could not have done it. The first prime minister that invited the ultra-Orthodox into the government, meaning when you invite someone into the coalition, it means that you're giving them a piece of the budget. You're giving them access to budgets. The first prime minister to do that was Menachem Begin in 1977. Until then, the ultra-Orthodox were symbolically invited into the coalition. For example, Levi Eshkol invited them into his coalition before the Six-Day War, gave them what's called a ministry without portfolio, meaning they were ministers, but no portfolio, meaning no budget. And there was that was done on purpose. But Menachem Begin was the first to bring them in. And in that respect, we use the term, he let the genie out of the bottle. Once they realized the political clout that comes with access to budgets, it really became a new game. And how do you build political power in Israel? By providing needed services. One of the best examples, which always my friends from the reform movement, for example, always used to complain about that. And I told them, if you had a real infrastructure in Israel, if you had a network of kindergartens and day schools and so on, and if you had access to impact the lives of hundreds of thousands of young Israelis, then 20 years from now, you will have 12 members in the Knesset. That's exactly what Shas did. And Shas started in kindergartens. I remember this as if it was yesterday. It was in the 1980s. And today, 30 years later, Shas is a recognized political power with access to budgets and so on. So that's the way the Israeli system works. And I agree with the depiction. It's accurate. There is no separation between church, religion and state in Israel, unfortunately, and that's another reason for all this friction that we're talking about. But the truth of the matter is that if, let's say, just for the sake of argument, if the reform movement wanted to have political clout, all they had to do was invest in Israeli society. I remember years ago, I had a meeting with late Rabbi, one of the leaders of the reform movement. His name was Harvey Fields from Los Angeles. And he had a plan to invest, just like Shas did in Israel, but it never really materialized, unfortunately. But that's the only way to go in Israel. You have to be on the ground. You have to provide services. You have to create your own support base and then grow with it. And
Ido, one of the things that we have to understand is a coalition government and the power that the minority has of making or breaking a government. And many times, I would say most, it's the religions may have one seat, but they make or break a government.
Yeah, so that's the nature of the Israeli system. There are good things about it and some very bad things about it. One of the good things about it is that it allows political nuance. Let me give you an example. A lot of people tell me, how do you explain the fact that 75 million people voted for Donald Trump? And how do you explain the fact that among African Americans and even among gays, he did better in 2020 than he did in 2016? And my answer to that is that the only reason 75 million people voted for Trump is because the two-party system doesn't leave enough room for nuance, which means how many votes Trump would have received if he had competition from the conservative side, if there were 3 or 4 different options. So people say yes, but he did go through primary elections and he defeated 16 other candidates. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about 4 different distinct platforms, all conservative. That's what you have in Israel. So in Israel, you have a great maneuverability, a great deal of nuance. If you're on the right but you're anti-religious, then you have Lieberman. Right? If you're on the right, but again, you're not anti-religious, but you're not pro-religious, then you can vote for, let's say, Bennett. Bennett is a religious guy, Orthodox guy, but he has many, or Gidon Sar, right? The Tikva Hadasha, the New Hope. If you're a centrist in Israel, woo, you have a whole buffet to choose from. There are lots of parties in the center. And if you're a leftist also.
It's true. We
So-
have a lousy system.
So that's the good thing about the Israeli system. The bad thing about the Israeli system is that it gives every fraction the power not only to bring down the coalition, worse than that, to blackmail the coalition. So it's not just about the survivability of the coalition. Usually those little parties, they don't want to go to elections. They don't want to reshuffle the cards because for them, and by the way, I predict that this government will complete its full term. Again, because Netanyahu will stay around. As long as Netanyahu is around, they're not going anywhere. It's a crazy situation. But the problem is that they use their leverage to basically milk more and more budget, more and more funds from the collective, budget. And so there are pluses and there are minuses with the Israeli system. But by and large, Israeli democracy proved a tremendous degree of resilience. It really is a very robust democracy. And as an observer, I'm very proud of the way Israeli democracy survived this onslaught. Yes, Alan.
Penelope,
Well, well,
you're
Sure, go ahead.
Penelope.
I'm Penelope today anyway. Let's do it tomorrow. But
I'll be Alan later.
yeah, the New York Times recently had a quiz based on the idea of 6 parties that one could take to see where one fit in this, chart of progressive and conservative. I'm sorry, but I don't remember what the others were. But the one word that I have not heard from either questioner or from you is anti-Semitism. And it appears to be on the rise, not only in this country, but also in Europe. And I don't know about other countries. And I mention it because it is often Jews and Israel are often conflated. It's not a case of separating that Israel is a country that operates in a certain way. It's a Jewish country, and if you're anti-Semitic, you see it as such. So I'm wondering where the picture of this rising, and please correct me if I'm mistaken in seeing it that way, the rising anti-Semitism affects Israel, standing operations, way it's viewed in the world.
Well, I don't think it affects Israel. Israel is, for better or worse, Israel is moving forward. Whether here's the story: anti-Semitism, on the one hand, is the oldest form of hatred in human history. Also, the most unique form of hatred, because the Jews are the only people throughout history that were accused of world domination. Even when the Jews were poor, they were accused of world domination. I just gave you the example of the Damascus blood libel. No one ever accused the African Americans of trying to dominate the world. Yeah, there are expressions of racism, but not accusations of trying to dominate the world or trying to dominate the banks or trying to dominate Hollywood. That's unique to the Jews. However, the forms of anti-Semitism are changing. If in the old days it was classic Christian, and it stems from the notion of the chosen people and the replacement theory, and I don't know to what extent you're familiar with Christian theology, but there's a whole stream of anti-Semitism that stems from the Jewish claim that we are the chosen people. All right, and what happened when Christianity was introduced? Who replaced the Jews? Catholic Church claims that they replaced the Jews and so on. And now you see more and more anti-Semitism that is stemming from the Islamic world, especially in Europe. When you see all the anti-Semitic incidents of late in Paris, in France or Belgium, all carried out by Muslims. And even in the United States, you had incidents like the LAX attack in July of 2002, carried out by Muslims and so on. So it's changing. Now, it's very tempting to see the connection with Israel and to say, okay, anti-Israelism is the new anti-Semitism. Well, there are two types of anti-Israelisms. There is the legitimate type, which is an argument around, let's say, Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And I'm a veteran of those arguments. And believe me, they lead nowhere, usually. Arguments do not produce friendship. They do not produce understanding. They do not produce peaceful coexistence. The whole notion of debate is archaic. It belongs to Europe of the 1300s. And then you have those who say, like the so-called BDS movement, Israel has no right to exist. Now that's how you know the difference between legitimate criticism and illegitimate criticism. When someone says to you, all the countries in the world have a right to exist, including Germany, post-World War II, including North Korea, including Iran, that says openly that they want to annihilate Israel. All those countries I have no problem with. But with you, I have a problem. You are the war criminal. Then you know, okay, I can't have a conversation with them. Everybody else has a right to exist. This is the epitome of racism. Every person is allowed to enter this club in Chicago, but the Jews. That's how you know that it's anti-Semitism. Every person is allowed to enter this library in Mississippi, but the blacks. Then you know it's racism. That's what's happening today. So to me, it's a lot of confusion between legitimate criticism, which I have no problem with, and illegitimate position that says Israel was born out of an ancient sin, has no right to exist. Now, many institutions, you mentioned the New York Times. The New York Times indirectly is supportive of that narrative. The second narrative. And there's plenty of evidence. I've been reading the New York Times for decades. And it's very, very consistent. In their view, Israel has no existence outside of the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So even if they write about an Israeli chef, they will never just write about an Israeli chef. They will write about an Israeli chef only if they can also write about a Palestinian chef. When they interview an Israeli NBA player, they will always ask the poor Israeli NBA player, a question about the Palestinians. What does he know about the Palestinians? In other words, in their minds, and I know what I'm talking about. I've been dealing with them for decades. There is a twinning. Israel does not exist without its twin. Israel has no right to have an independent existence outside of the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So indirectly, they are actually fueling the BDS narrative. The damage of the BDS narrative is that it pushes the solution away from the Palestinians. That's the danger of the BDS narrative. The illusion or the false comparison between Israel and apartheid South
I don't
Africa.
know what BDS is.
BDS is the idea that Israel, the only way to force Israel into an agreement with the Palestinians, completely ignoring, by the way, the fact that the Palestinians declined all the proposals so far. The only way is to boycott Israel.
Boycott.
So if you will suffocate Israeli economy, just like what we did with South Africa, and then they take it a step further. They say we are separating the term apartheid from its historical South African context. And now we are deploying South African on the Israeli-Palestinian context. Now that's an insult to all the real victims of apartheid. There is, you can say a lot of things about Israel, and I will be the first critic. But to say that Israel is apartheid is, first of all, to basically display one's ignorance. And it's an insult. It's shameful for the real victims of apartheid. There is no apartheid in Israel, not even remotely close to apartheid. Yeah, there is a conflict with the Palestinians, the bloody conflict. The conflict's been going on for many, many years. You can blame both sides for the stalemate, but you cannot say that Israel is an apartheid state. When you have people in Israel, Arabs, you find them in every walk of life, they're in the Supreme Court. The judge that put our president in prison was an Arab judge. Show me that in apartheid South Africa. It's a joke.
Ido, in some class I took, when we were discussing the chosen people, it wasn't that God chose us, but that we chose the 10 Commandments. Is that just a convenient picture, or is it accurate?
Well,
I like it.
It's one of the interpretations. There's another interpretation that says that the chosen people is not an advantage, but it's a burden. It's the God is entrusting you with the task of healing the world, of fixing the world, repairing the world. That's a great deal of responsibility. But you will always find the other who will see this as a sign of arrogance. And we learned in sociology that it's not you who defines who you are. It's always the other. Let me give you an example. Recently, my son is studying film and TV at Tel Aviv University. And I remember when I started studying at Tel Aviv University, my father bought me in 1984 the autobiography of Roman Polanski because he was a survivor. And I remember, and I gave my son this book again to read. I haven't read the book since 1984. And in the opening chapter, Roman Polanski writes about his mother. He said, "Me and my father survived the Holocaust," he writes. "But my mother, who was Catholic, is the only member of my family who died in Auschwitz." He said, "My mom never converted to Judaism, never practiced Judaism, yet she's the only member of our family that was killed by the Nazis." What does it tell you? That the power to define who we are is not in our hands. It's always the other who defines us. So when someone says to me, I don't give a damn about this, I don't give a damn about that, I'm not even Jewish, I'm half Jewish or whatever, the Nazis didn't really care. about where you stand politically. And that's the sad thing. And we have to understand that reality. I think Merle and Alan wanted to ask questions.
Yes.
Alan,
Hi.
your name starts with an A, so go alphabetically.
Good. I'm glad I'm not Zach. For those of us who consider us progressives and progressive Jews, the two-state solution has always been like this glimmer of hope, and it seems to be receding. Can you say something about whether or not that is viable at all, where it stands now, how you think the current government is likely to make any moves in that direction, or is this just this kind of idyllic dream that's really never going to see the light of day?
Well, it's certainly not an idyllic dream. It's the only viable solution on the table. What's the problem? The problem is that on the Israeli side, you find this very peculiar situation where most Israelis will tell you, yes, I support the two-state solution. It's the only solution because there is no real one-state solution. What is the meaning of one state? It means that Zionism ends. Right. That's what it means. The end of the Jewish idea, of the Jewish state idea. But so the two-state solution is the only solution because of Israel, not because of the Palestinians, for Israel's sake. But the same majority that supports the two-state solution will also tell you at the same time that it's not going to happen. And they'll explain why. Because most Israelis realized, as a result of those three events that I mentioned, the decline of the Clinton plan, what happened as a result of the pullout from Gaza, and what happened after the decline of the Olmert plan, most Israelis will tell you the conflict is not about land. Because if it was about land, they could have had their state many years ago, 21 years ago. So what is it about? It's about their ongoing refusal to accept our right to exist. So it's not a territorial conflict, it's an existential conflict. Now, the problem the Palestinians have is not with Israeli political leadership. Menachem Begin gave back all of the Sinai. The ultra-nationalist Menachem Begin. And I believe that if Bennett will have a real opportunity, a real partner, he will do the same. But the problem that the Palestinians have is the Israeli public, not the Israeli political leadership. The Israeli public is not there. The Israeli public will tell you, yes, two-state, great idea, not going to happen. And why it's not going to happen? Because the Palestinians don't really accept our right to exist. And again, I have to say, most progressives in Israel will tell you that. They agree with my analysis. So sadly, this is where we are. Again, 12 years of saying time is on my side didn't help. Right. I'm not taking the blame off Israel as well. But Palestinians, if they really wanted to have a state, they could have had it a long time ago.
So how
By the way, Ben Gurion was offered a similar deal. If you think about what happened at the UN, October and November of 1947, the partition plan was not his dream plan. It was a big compromise, but he was a pragmatist. He was not a maximalist. And he said yes, and the rest is history.
So if it's not going to if the two-state solution is unlikely to happen, then are we in a constant state of war? Constantly?
No.
Forever?
What you're having now is not a state of war. You have every once in a while, it's an ongoing management of conflict with Hamas. With the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, actually things are improving. I don't know if you know that, but the 6 prisoners that just escaped, it's thanks to the Palestinians that we got some of them back. Israel is working very nicely with the Palestinians. The economic ties are improving every day. And so what you're looking at, Ariel Sharon used to call it livable arrangements. Life has its own inertia. And at the end of the day, Israelis and Palestinians want the same thing, not their leaderships, the people. They want the same thing. They want normal life. They want to provide for their families, education and food and health and security and blah, blah, blah. And that's what's happening on the ground. And let me give you a very funny, Alex, you're in Brooklyn. So there's a co-op in Brooklyn that decided to boycott Sabra Hummus, which is a PepsiCo company. By the way, it's a PepsiCo company. So they're not selling in their store Sabra Hummus because it's partly owned by an Israeli company, okay? Now you go, I challenge you to go to any supermarket in the West Bank and you'll find plenty of made in Israel products, meaning while the progressives in Brooklyn are boycotting Israel, the Palestinians are gladly buying. So
I'm a member of that co-op, and I can tell you that at one of their meetings they had a 2-hour-long debate, not about Sabra hummus, but about SodaStream. And which was actually very interesting, because when they did argue to stop stocking the SodaStream, what was pointed out was that a lot of the factory was actually in large part populated by Israeli Arabs who were employed by it. So these things are never simple.
They never know. It was 800 of the 1,200 employees were Palestinians.
Right.
And they received full health care, great salaries, and they supported their families and they were happy about it. Now, they forced the factory out of the West Bank. Now the factory is in the Negev. All the 800 Palestinians were fired. And so that's what happened. And so, we use the term holier than the Pope. That's what happened. All right, I think Merle wanted to ask a question.
With your branding hat on, you shared with us some of the research that was done to give you a fuller understanding of how Israel's perceived. I want to take it to the flip of that. Can you share with us some of the initiatives that Israel might take to modify whatever branding modifications you're interested in making? And what is the goal of branding in Israel?
All right, so branding nations in general is about improving the performance of the place across the board. All right, so let's take Chicago. It's a perfect example. Chicago became synonymous with crime, but we know that Chicago is way more than crime, right? So Chicago is a full, is one of the most important cities in the world. So how do you overcome this gap? And ask yourself a question: how come that Chicago became synonymous with crime? One of the answers is that the political leadership constantly talks about how they're fighting crime. So even when they're successful fighting crime, the fact that they constantly talk about it creates the association in people's minds between Chicago and the context of crime. So it doesn't matter whether you've been successful or unsuccessful fighting crime, you will be forever etched with crime in people's brains. That's what happened to Israel. Israel's leadership constantly talked about the conflict and basically turned Israel into a one-dimensional brand that doesn't exist outside the context of the unhappy geopolitical circumstances of the region. So when I came along, I looked at the research, and I discovered that Israel was asking you, American people, the wrong question. Israel was asking you, tell me, do you support me politically? And when most Americans said yes, because they're good Protestants, Israel was happy. But the real question that we should have asked is, are you attracted to me? Not whether you support my policies. Because Daniel Kahneman is teaching us, he won the Nobel Prize in economics, that people can live perfectly fine with the disconnect between the rational and the emotional. I can agree with you up here, but dislike you down here, and vice versa. I can disagree with you and like you. Israel never understood that complexity. And we thought that if you like me politically, you will be attracted to me. Not true. Most people that like Israeli policies actually will never do business in Israel. Most people that support Israeli policies have no desire to travel to Israel. When you look for the best example is the gay community. We have thousands of gay people coming to Tel Aviv every year for the Pride Parade. If you had asked them, where do you stand on Israeli policies in Gaza? I assure you, 95% of them will have a negative position. Yet, what draws them to Tel Aviv has nothing to do with the Palestinians. Israel never understood that complexity. We did the same thing with the evangelicals, assuming that the only thing the evangelicals care about is the conflict. No. I traveled in the South, tens of churches. I can tell you the only thing they care about is religion. They don't care about politics, contrary to what people tell you.
But
They follow their pastor. When they come to Israel, they want to go to the Sea of Galilee. They're not interested in the settlements. They're not interested. I mean, a few of them go to visit the prime minister. Okay, it's not new. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, is there some recognition within the higher echelons of government that there are modifications to what is said publicly that might influence that?
No, first of all, the government is luckily less and less important in the process of communicating a country to the world. Why? Because since Steve Jobs introduced the first smartphone, that power is given to us, the people. And now, so you ask me, what's the solution to that problem? Israel is being reduced to the conflict only. How do you overcome this? By broadening the scope, by communicating Israel through a much broader lens that communicates the totality of life in Israel. That was the key to the success of the branding of New York. Again, New York faced same crisis in the 1970s, crime, police corruption, fiscal crisis. New York became synonymous with bad news.
But where in Israel is the center of initiating that broader kind of communication?
So it was me for several years. Unfortunately, well, the Ministry of Tourism is carrying the torch now. And some organizations in the United States that were influenced by the work that was done with the Brand Israel Group in New York some 20 years ago, most notably the Jewish National Fund, very strong in Chicago, by the way, that decided to raise the flag of the environment as a result of those studies. Then you had several organizations that were established, Israel 21C, that is a wonderful organization based out of San Francisco. You have ITREC, which is an organization that sends MBA students, not Jewish, to Israel for academic credit based in New York. Vibe Israel is an organization that brings influencers based in Tel Aviv. No Camels is an organization that it's like a news agency. And I can go on and on. There are many organizations that were influenced by our work. And today, you could say, I mean, I have research to support my argument, but there is more. It's not that the work is done. We're far from it, but there's more recognition of Israel's creative contributions than in the past. And it's a combination of the work that was done by the government, but mostly really the person that really deserves the credit is Steve Jobs. He never intended to improve Israel's brand. I'm sure that he never even thought about Israel, but the fact that the smartphone enabled each and every Israeli to communicate their lives authentically and directly with no mediation changed the positioning of Israel in the world, because Israelis are very connected to the world, unlike other nations. For example, in Russia, we conducted research in Russia in 2010. We discovered that the Russian people in general, in terms of their understanding of what's actually happening in Israel domestically, they had the highest level of understanding. And the reason is because we have 1.5 million Israelis that speak Russian, and they communicate in Russian, and people in Russia can watch Israeli television channels in Russian, in Russian. And so the Russians have their share of exposure to real life in Israel. It has nothing to do with the political leadership.
Thank you.
So social media is really changing. And by the way, tourism before COVID-19, we went from, when we started with Brand Israel, 1 million tourists a year. Before COVID, we reached already 5 million. And if not for COVID, we would have been at 6 million this year. So, and again, smartphones, micro-targeting, Steve Jobs. These are the people that really branded Israel, not me.
Thank you.
I remember years ago, Abba Eban saying that the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And when I look at the agreements that were reached and then couldn't be implemented, I mean, what the region could have been, we are going it alone. I put that in quotes. The Palestinians aren't with us. They could have been. Is that accurate, Ido?
Well, Israelis also had their share of mistakes.
Yep.
But look, as I said before, when you're taking the maximalist approach, there's always a danger that you're going to be left with nothing. And it's a very dangerous proposition to say all or nothing. Very dangerous. Usually in diplomacy, you never do that. You never do that. You never say all or nothing. You always leave some room for maneuverability. But that's, and again, the sad thing is that Abu Mazen, although again, committed himself to nonviolence, is less pragmatic than Arafat on this issue. It's very sad. Because I believe that he's deep inside, I think that he's a decent person because he took a great risk. A lot of people don't remember, but after Arafat died, when he came to the mourners' tent, Hamas made an attempt on his life. There was an attempt to assassinate him because of the fact that he stood for nonviolence. And unfortunately, he doesn't have that same, insight when it comes to Palestinian diplomacy. It's very sad. But anyhow, I'm optimistic as we move forward. I think that great things are happening on the ground. I think that the fact that, again, Israeli democracy survived such an onslaught. I mean, we lived through this. It was a nightmare. Is a good sign for the future. It's been a pleasure, Barbara. Thank you for inviting me.
Ido,
You all have my email. You can send me your questions. And those of you who didn't get a chance to ask, you all can always send me a question via email.
Thank you.
Ido, this was
Amazing.
unbelievable.
Wonderful.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
Much.
it's past midnight here. We're going to get some sleep.
Go to bed.
All right.
Wasn't dream.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Love
much.
you
Bye-bye.
dearly.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Bye.